Ruby Sinclair's breath caught in her throat as she peered through the window of her small wooden cabin. The evening stage was due in less than an hour, and with it, her ticket to a new life far from Silver Creek, Colorado. The year was 1876, and at 23 years old, Ruby had made the most daring decision of her life to become a mail-order bride to a man she had never met. "Just a few more minutes," she whispered to herself, tightening the strings of her weathered leather travel bag. Inside were all her worldly possessions: 3 dresses, a hairbrush that had belonged to her mother, a small book of poetry, and the bundle of letters from Mr. Howard Fleming of San Francisco, the man who had promised her a comfortable home and a respectable life as his wife. Ruby's fingers trembled as she traced the edge of the most recent letter. "My dearest Miss Sinclair," it began in neat, careful penmanship, "I await your arrival with great anticipation. The house I have prepared for us is modest but comfortable, with a view of the bay that I believe you will find most agreeable." The letter continued with polite formalities and practical arrangements, nothing that would make a romantic's heart flutter, but to Ruby, it represented escape. Escape from the hardscrabble existence that had been her life since her father died in a mining accident 3 years prior. Escape from the leering glances of men who saw a young woman alone as fair game. Escape from Silver Creek, where memories of everything she had lost lingered on every dusty corner. A cloud of dust on the horizon caught her attention. Too early for the stage, she thought, her brow furrowing. The rider approached at a gallop, his figure growing larger against the backdrop of the setting sun. There was something familiar about the way he sat in the saddle, something that made Ruby's heart race with an emotion she couldn't quite name. As the rider drew closer, Ruby's knees weakened. Preston Walker, the cowboy who had worked her father's small ranch before everything fell apart. The man who had disappeared 2 years ago without so much as a goodbye after she had foolishly believed his sweet words and gentle touches meant something. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his tall frame unfolding with the same easy grace she remembered. His dark hair was longer now, curling at the nape of his neck beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and his face was more weathered, but his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, were exactly as she remembered. "Ruby," he called out, striding toward the cabin with purpose in every step. She pulled away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. This couldn't be happening. Not today of all days. She grabbed her bag and hat, determined to meet the stage before it even arrived. She would not let Preston Walker derail her plans. Ruby yanked open the door only to find him standing there, hand raised to knock, those blue eyes widening at her travel attire. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice deeper than she remembered. "That's none of your concern," she replied, trying to step around him. His hand shot out, not touching her but blocking her path. "I heard in town you're leaving. For a man you've never met. A mail-order bride arrangement." The judgment in his tone sparked her temper. "And what business is that of yours, Mr. Walker? You forfeited any right to an opinion on my life when you rode away without a word 2 years ago." Preston's jaw tightened. "Ruby, you can't do this. You don't know this man. I know he offered me security and respect in his letters, which is more than I can say for some." His eyes flashed with something hurt, anger, before he drew himself up to his full height. "You're not going anywhere," he stated firmly. Ruby's indignation flared. "Excuse me? Not until you hear what I have to say." His voice softened slightly. "Please, Ruby, 10 minutes of your time is all I ask." The distant rumble of the approaching stage made Ruby's decision more urgent. 10 minutes. The stage would need time to change horses anyway. 10 minutes to finally get the answers she'd craved for 2 years, to put the ghost of Preston Walker firmly in her past where he belonged. 10 minutes, she agreed, her voice clipped. "Then I'm getting on that stage, and you will not stop me." Preston nodded, removing his hat as he followed her back inside the cabin. The small space seemed to shrink with his presence, the air between them charged with unspoken words and buried emotions. "You look well," he said, his eyes taking in every detail of her face. "Don't," Ruby warned. "Don't pretend this is a social call between old friends. Say what you came to say." Preston set his hat on the table, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so familiar it made Ruby's chest ache. "I came back for you," he said simply. Ruby almost laughed. "After 2 years? How convenient that you arrive on the very day I'm set to leave." "It's not convenience, it's desperation," he countered. "I rode 3 days straight when I heard you were leaving, barely stopped to rest my horse. And I'm supposed to be moved by that? After 2 years of silence." Preston took a step toward her, then seemed to think better of it. "I never meant to be gone so long. I went to make something of myself, to be worthy of asking for your hand." Ruby crossed her arms. "You didn't even say goodbye, because I knew if I looked in your eyes, I wouldn't be able to leave." His voice cracked slightly. "And I had to leave, Ruby. Your father had just died. The ranch was failing. What could I offer you then? A life of struggle and hardship? You deserved better." "What I deserved was the truth. A choice." Preston's eyes held hers. "You're right. I was a coward. But I've changed, Ruby. I've built something. A cattle operation north of here. Good land, solid business. It's taken me 2 years to get it stable enough that I could come back and offer you the life you deserve." Ruby shook her head, fighting the traitorous hope that wanted to bloom in her chest. "And you think you can just ride in here and I'll fall into your arms? That I'll abandon my plans because you've finally decided I fit into yours? No, I don't expect that." Preston's voice was soft but steady. "But I'm asking you to consider it, to consider me. The man I am now, not the boy who ran." The sound of the stage rolling into town drifted through the open window. Ruby glanced at her bag, then back at Preston. "Your 10 minutes are up," she said quietly. Preston nodded, reaching for his hat. "At least let me escort you to the stage." The walk to the stagecoach station was painfully silent. Ruby's mind raced with conflicting emotions. The practical part of her brain reminded her that Mr. Fleming offered certainty, a clear arrangement with defined expectations. Preston offered only promises and a history of heartbreak. The stagecoach waited, its driver already loading luggage. A few passengers milled about, preparing for the journey. This was it, the moment she would leave Silver Creek behind forever. "Ruby," Preston said as they reached the edge of the platform, "before you go, there's something else you should know." She turned to face him, steeling herself against the impact of those blue eyes. "What is it?" "Mr. Fleming isn't who you think he is." Preston's expression was grave. "That's part of why I rode so hard to get here. I have a friend in San Francisco who recognized the name from your letters. Fleming is known there for bringing young women out west under false pretenses. He's not looking for a wife, Ruby. He runs establishments where women are not treated as they should be." Ruby's blood ran cold. "You're lying," she whispered. But even as the words left her mouth, doubt crept in. The letters had been proper, yet vague. There had never been a photograph, always excuses for why he couldn't send one. "I wish I were," Preston replied. "I wouldn't lie about this, not even to keep you here." Ruby's gaze dropped to the folded paper Preston was extending toward her. She took it with trembling fingers, unfolding a newspaper clipping from San Francisco. There it was in black and white: Howard Fleming, arrested for trafficking young women, released due to insufficient evidence. "This could be another Howard Fleming," she said weakly. "The address matches the one on your letters," Preston pointed out gently. Ruby felt the ground shift beneath her feet. All her careful plans, her escape route, suddenly revealed as a trap far worse than the life she was trying to leave behind. Last call for boarding, the stagecoach driver announced. Preston touched her elbow lightly. You don't have to decide anything about me or us right now. But please, don't get on that stage. Ruby looked at the stagecoach, then back at Preston, her mind reeling. The future she had planned was disintegrating before her eyes, leaving her untethered and uncertain. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice small. Stay, Preston said simply. Stay and give me a chance to prove I'm not the same man who left. If you still want to go somewhere else after that, I'll help you get there safely. I promise. Ruby closed her eyes briefly, gathering her courage. When she opened them, she turned to the stagecoach driver. It seems I won't be needing that ticket after all, she called out. The relief on Preston's face was palpable, but Ruby held up a hand before he could speak. This doesn't mean I forgive you, and it doesn't mean I'm staying for good. It just means I'm not getting on that stage today. Preston nodded solemnly. That's all I'm asking for, a chance. As the stagecoach pulled away in a cloud of dust, Ruby felt a strange mixture of fear and possibility settle over her. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she was curious to find out. The walk back to Ruby's cabin was less tense than their earlier journey, but a cautious distance remained between them. Preston carried her bag, sneaking glances at her profile when he thought she wasn't looking. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty path, and the familiar scent of sage and pine filled the air. I kept your father's ranch going, Preston said, breaking the silence. Bought it from the bank when they were set to foreclose. Couldn't bear to see it go to strangers. Ruby's step faltered. You own my father's land? It's still your father's land in my mind, he replied. I just hold the deed until… Well, I always hoped you might want it back someday. Ruby's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. The ranch had been her childhood home, the place where she'd learned to ride, where her mother had taught her to bake bread before the fever took her, where her father had built a life for them with his calloused hands and stubborn determination. I thought it was gone forever, she said quietly. Nothing's gone forever, Ruby, Preston replied, his voice gentle. Some things just get lost for a while until someone cares enough to find them again. They reached the cabin, and Ruby hesitated at the door. The small structure had been her refuge after selling the ranch house to pay her father's debts, but it had never felt like home. Just a temporary shelter until she could find her way forward. Would you like to see it? Preston asked. The ranch, see what I've done with it. Ruby considered his offer. Part of her wanted to keep her distance, to protect her heart from hoping too much. But another part, a stronger part, needed to know. Yes, she decided. I'd like that. Tomorrow, then? I could come by in the morning. Ruby nodded, then took her bag from his hands. Tomorrow. Preston settled his hat back on his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Get some rest, Ruby. It's been quite a day. As he turned to leave, Ruby called after him. Preston? He looked back, hope evident in his eyes. Thank you, she said, for the warning about Mr. Fleming. Whatever else lies between us, I'm grateful for that. Always, he replied simply, then mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Ruby with more questions than answers and a curious lightness in her chest that felt dangerously like hope. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the crisp autumn air carrying the promise of winter. Ruby rose early, her sleep having been fitful and filled with dreams of roads not taken and faces half remembered. She dressed with care in her best day dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes and pinned her chestnut hair in a neat bun. As she waited for Preston, Ruby busied herself with tidying the already immaculate cabin. Her restless energy had nowhere to go, and her mind kept circling back to the same questions. Could she trust Preston's change of heart? Was she a fool for even considering giving him another chance? What would her life have been like if she had boarded that stage? A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Preston stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking freshly shaved and somewhat nervous. Behind him, 2 horses waited patiently, his own sturdy bay and a gentle-looking Palomino mare that Ruby recognized with a jolt. "Sonny?" she gasped, moving past Preston to approach the horse. The mare nickered softly, pushing her velvet nose into Ruby's outstretched hand in greeting. "She's been missing you," Preston said, smiling at the reunion. "Wouldn't let anyone else ride her for months after I brought her to the ranch." Ruby stroked the mare's neck, overwhelmed with emotion. Sonny had been her horse since girlhood, a gift from her father on her 16th birthday. Selling her had been one of the hardest sacrifices Ruby had made after her father's death. "How did you find her?" Ruby asked, turning to Preston with wonder in her eyes. "Tracked her through 3 counties, he replied simply. "The man who bought her from you sold her to a rancher near Denver. Took some convincing, but he eventually agreed to sell her back." Ruby blinked back unexpected tears. "You did that?" Preston shrugged, but his eyes were serious. "I know what she means to you." The simple statement held so much weight and acknowledgement that despite his absence, he had remembered the things that mattered to her, had acted on that knowledge in a way that went beyond mere words. "Thank you," Ruby whispered, the 2 words inadequate for the gratitude swelling in her chest. "She's yours," Preston said. "Whether you stay or go, Sonny belongs with you." Ruby looked from Preston to the mare and back again, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Instead, she nodded and moved to mount the horse, her body remembering the familiar motion despite the years that had passed. They rode in companionable silence, following the winding trail that led from town toward the foothills where the Sinclair ranch nestled in a verdant valley. Ruby felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation as familiar landmarks appeared: the lightning-struck oak that marked the property line, the small creek where she used to catch frogs as a child, the rolling pastures where her father's modest herd had once grazed. When the ranch house came into view, Ruby reined Sonny to a stop, taking in the changes. The old wooden structure looked fresh with new paint, the sagging porch had been rebuilt, and the barn that had been leaning dangerously the last time she saw it stood straight and solid. Fields that had lain fallow in her father's final years now flourished with grazing cattle, and a new corral held several fine-looking horses. "You've been busy," she said finally, her voice soft with wonder. Preston watched her face carefully. "Your father built a good foundation. I just picked up where he left off." "It's more than that," Ruby countered, gesturing to the thriving ranch before them. This is what he always dreamed it could be." Preston's expression softened. "He'd be proud to see it now. Prouder still of how you've carried on despite everything." Ruby swallowed hard against the emotion rising in her throat. "Show me the rest," she said, urging Sonny forward before her feelings could overwhelm her. The tour of the ranch revealed more of Preston's careful stewardship. The inside of the house had been maintained with respect for its history. Her mother's rocking chair still sat by the fireplace. Her father's old desk remained in the study, and even the faded quilt Ruby had learned to sew on still hung on the wall. But there were improvements too. New windows that didn't let in the winter drafts, a larger kitchen stove, sturdy new furniture built by a local craftsman. "You've lived here all this time?" Ruby asked as they walked through the familiar rooms that now felt both strange and welcoming. Preston nodded. "It never felt right to change too much. I always thought of it as keeping it ready. Just in case. In case I came back," Ruby finished his unspoken thought. "Yes," he admitted. "Foolish hope, maybe, but it kept me going through some hard times." They ended the tour on the back porch, where 2 chairs faced the distant mountains. Preston brought out a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses, and they sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the peaceful scene before them. "Why didn't you write to me?" Ruby finally asked the question that had haunted her for 2 years. "If you were doing all this, if you were planning to come back, why leave me in the dark?" Preston set his glass down carefully. "I wanted to. I started 100 letters, but none of them seemed right. At first, I had nothing to offer but promises, and I knew you'd had your fill of those. Then, as things started to succeed, I was afraid that you might have moved on, found someone else. The longer I waited, the harder it became. So what changed? Besides hearing I was leaving," Preston's eyes met hers directly. "I realized that living with the possibility of your rejection was better than living with the certainty of never seeing you again." The simple honesty of his answer resonated within Ruby. Wasn't that the same courage she had summoned to become a mail-order bride? The willingness to risk an unknown future rather than accept a stagnant present? "I was so angry with you," she confessed. "For leaving, for not saying goodbye. I told myself I hated you." "You had every right to hate me," Preston acknowledged. "I broke my promises. I hurt you when I swore I never would. Yet here we are," Ruby said, gesturing to the ranch around them. Preston leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "I'm not asking for forgiveness I haven't earned, Ruby. I'm just asking for a chance to show you who I am now, and to see who you've become. We're not the same people we were 2 years ago." Ruby considered his words. It was true she wasn't the same naive girl who had given her heart away so easily. Loss and struggle had tempered her, made her stronger and more cautious. And Preston was right, he seemed different too. More grounded, more purposeful. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked carefully. "Stay," he said simply. "Not with me, not yet. The Miller widow is looking for help with her boarding house in town. She'd give you room and board plus wages. You could have your independence, make your own way, get to know the man I am now without pressure. And if, after a time, you decide there's nothing left between us, I'll respect that." It was a reasonable offer, one that gave her agency and time. Ruby looked out at the mountains, their distant peaks touched with the first snow of the season. She thought of the stage that had departed without her, of the man in San Francisco whose letters had nearly lured her into disaster, of the small cabin in town that had never felt like home. Then she looked at Preston, at the ranch he had saved, at the life he had built, a life that seemed to have a ruby-shaped space waiting within it. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay. For now." The smile that broke across Preston's face was like sunrise after a long night, brilliant and full of promise. It stirred something in Ruby's heart that she had thought long buried, a dangerous, wonderful feeling of possibility. "For now," he agreed, not pushing for more. "That's all I'm asking for." As they rode back to town in the golden afternoon light, Ruby felt as though she stood at a crossroads. Behind her lay the path not taken, the stagecoach journey to San Francisco and whatever fate would have awaited her there. Ahead lay 2 diverging trails, one leading to a solitary future of her own making, the other winding back toward Preston and the ranch that had once been home. For the first time in 2 years, Ruby wasn't certain which path she would choose, but she was surprisingly content with the uncertainty. For now, it was enough to be riding sunny again, with the mountains at her back and an open road before her. The following weeks saw Ruby settled into a new routine at Mrs. Miller's boarding house. The widow was a kind-hearted woman in her 60s who had been running the establishment since her husband passed away 5 years earlier. She welcomed Ruby with open arms, clearly relieved to have younger help with the cooking, cleaning, and managing of the 6 rooms that were usually occupied by traveling salesmen, cowboys between jobs, or the occasional family passing through. The work was honest and straightforward, leaving Ruby with enough energy at the end of each day to appreciate her newfound stability. Her room, though small, was neat and private, a luxury after the constant vigilance required when living alone in her cabin. Mrs. Miller respected Ruby's independence but offered friendship as well. Their evenings often spent sharing tea and conversation by the kitchen stove. Preston kept his distance, careful not to crowd Ruby or pressure her in any way. He came to town twice a week for supplies, and would take his meals at the boarding house during those visits. Their interactions were friendly but measured, both of them feeling their way forward with caution. "Mr. Walker seems quite taken with you," Mrs. Miller observed one evening as they prepared dinner for their boarders. Preston had left earlier, after lingering over his coffee and engaging Ruby in conversation about a book they had both read. Ruby felt her cheeks warm. "We have a history," she admitted, focusing intently on the potatoes she was peeling. "So I've gathered," Mrs. Miller replied with a knowing smile. "The whole town has been watching this slow dance between you two. They say he bought your father's ranch and kept it running all this time, waiting for you to come back to it." "People talk too much," Ruby murmured, but there was no real irritation in her tone. "Small towns run on talk, my dear," Mrs. Miller laughed. "But in this case I think they might be right. That man looks at you like you're the water in a desert." Ruby shook her head, but couldn't entirely suppress her smile. "It's complicated, Mrs. Miller." "Love usually is," the older woman replied sagely. "But sometimes it's the complicated ones that last the longest. My Harold and I couldn't stand each other when we first met. I thought he was the most arrogant man I'd ever encountered." "What changed?" Ruby asked, genuinely curious. Mrs. Miller's eyes took on a faraway look. "Life happened. Circumstances threw us together during a terrible blizzard. 3 days trapped in a stagecoach station showed me who he really was beneath all that bluster, a kind, thoughtful man who was just trying to make his way in a hard world. By the time the snow cleared, I couldn't imagine my life without him." Ruby considered the widow's words as she finished preparing the vegetables. Her own feelings for Preston remained tangled, the hurt of his abandonment still tender, but increasingly overshadowed by the evidence of his changed character. Each interaction revealed more of the man he had become: steady, thoughtful, patient, and undeniably still drawn to her. As autumn deepened toward winter, Preston began inviting Ruby to the ranch on her days off. These visits were casual and undemanding rides across the property to check on cattle, afternoons spent preparing the garden for winter, or simply sitting on the porch with hot coffee, watching the changing landscape. Through these shared moments, Ruby began to see not just what Preston had accomplished, but who he had become. "My father would be amazed by all this," Ruby commented one crisp November day as they rode the fence line. Preston had expanded the ranch's boundaries, doubling its size and increasing the herd substantially. "He taught me most of what I know," Preston replied, adjusting his hat against the low winter sun. "I still hear his voice sometimes when I'm making decisions. Never take more than the land can give back, he used to say." Ruby smiled at the memory. He lived by that. Even when others were overgrazing their pastures during the drought years, he rotated the herd to protect the grass. "That's why this land is still fertile when some of the neighboring spreads are struggling," Preston observed. "Your father's wisdom at work." They crested a small rise, and Preston reined his horse to a stop. Below them stretched a vista of the entire ranch, the house nestled in its protective grove of trees, the barn and outbuildings, the cattle dotting the pastures, and beyond, the town of Silver Creek just visible in the distance. "I've been thinking," Preston said carefully, his eyes on the horizon rather than on Ruby. "The north pasture would be perfect for horses. Quality stock, not just working animals. There's good money in breeding if it's done right." Ruby glanced at him curiously. "You want to expand into horse breeding?" "We could," Preston said, emphasizing the "we" slightly. "You've always had a way with horses. Your father used to say you could gentle the wildest Mustang with just your voice. The implication hung in the air between them, a future together, building something neither could achieve alone. Ruby felt her heart quicken at the possibility, but caution still held her back. Preston, she began. It's just an idea, he interrupted gently. Something to consider for the future. No pressure, Ruby. I promised you time, and I meant it. She nodded, grateful for his understanding. As they turned their horses back toward the ranch house, Ruby realized something had shifted within her. She was no longer just visiting her father's ranch. She was beginning to imagine herself as part of its future. That evening, as they shared a simple supper in the ranch house kitchen, the domesticity of the scene struck Ruby with unexpected force. Preston had proven to be a competent cook, another skill he had developed in her absence, and the beef stew simmering on the stove filled the kitchen with savory aromas that made it feel like home. Tell me about San Francisco, Ruby said suddenly, surprising herself as much as Preston. She hadn't spoken of her abandoned plans since that first day. Preston set down his coffee cup, considering her question. It's nothing like here, he said finally. All noise and bustle, people everywhere, ships coming and going in the harbor at all hours. Beautiful in its way, but overwhelming if you're used to open spaces. You've been there, he nodded. Twice. Once when I first left here I thought I might find work on the docks. And again last year to establish a contract with a meat supplier who ships to the mining camps. Ruby tried to imagine it, the city by the bay that she had pictured so often while reading Mr. Fleming's letters. I thought it would be my fresh start, she admitted quietly. Somewhere no one knew me or my history, where I could become someone new. Preston's eyes were gentle with understanding. Is that still what you want? A completely fresh start? Ruby looked around the kitchen at the table her father had built, the window where her mother had kept herbs growing on the sill, the door frame where notches marked her growth from child to woman. Then she looked at Preston, this man who bridged her past and a possible future. I used to think so, she said slowly. Now I'm not so sure. There's value in being somewhere that holds your history, I think. As long as it doesn't trap you there. This place doesn't have to be a trap, Ruby, Preston said softly. It could be a foundation. The words resonated in her heart, echoing her own evolving thoughts. Before she could respond, however, the peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats approaching at speed. Preston was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. It's Tom Wilson, he said, recognizing the rider. Something's wrong. They met the ranch hand at the door. Tom, a weathered cowboy who had worked for Ruby's father and stayed on when Preston took over, dismounted in a rush, his expression grave. Fire in town, he reported breathlessly. The boarding house. Mrs. Miller sent me to fetch you both. It's bad, boss. Ruby felt the blood drain from her face. The boarding house? But that's where let's go, Preston said, already moving toward the barn. Tom, get the men. Bring buckets, blankets, anything that might help. The ride to town was a blur of fear and urgency. As they crested the final hill, the orange glow of flames was visible against the darkening sky. Ruby's heart pounded with dread, not just for her few possessions in her room, but for Mrs. Miller and the boarders, for the home that had sheltered her these past weeks. Silver Creek had no formal fire brigade, but the townspeople had organized themselves into a bucket line from the town well to the burning building. The boarding house was engulfed in flames on one side, the fire spreading rapidly despite the efforts to contain it. Mrs. Miller? Ruby called out desperately as they dismounted. She's safe, the town doctor responded, pointing to where the widow sat on a bench across the street, a blanket around her shoulders and tears streaming down her face. Got everyone out in time, thank the Lord. Ruby rushed to the older woman's side while Preston joined the firefighting efforts. "What happened?" she asked, taking Mrs. Miller's trembling hands in her own. "The kitchen stove," Mrs. Miller said, her voice quavering. "Something must have caught while I was upstairs. By the time I smelled the smoke." She broke off, watching as part of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. "Everything I have is in that house." Ruby held the widow close as they watched the fire consume the building despite the town's best efforts. By midnight, it was clear that nothing could be saved. The boarding house was gone, reduced to smoldering timbers and ash. In the somber aftermath, as townspeople dispersed and the stunned boarders sought shelter with neighbors, Preston approached Ruby and Mrs. Miller. "I've arranged rooms at the hotel for tonight," he said, his clothes and face smudged with soot from his efforts fighting the fire. "For both of you and all the boarders. It's taken care of." Mrs. Miller looked up at him with tear-reddened eyes. "That's very generous, Mr. Walker, but I have nothing left. No way to pay." "Don't worry about that now," he interrupted gently. "We'll figure it out tomorrow. Tonight you both need rest." As they walked toward the hotel, Ruby found herself leaning into Preston's solid presence beside her. The events of the night had shaken her deeply, reminding her how quickly security could vanish, how fragile the structures of their lives truly were. "What will she do?" Ruby whispered as Preston escorted them to their rooms. The boarding house was everything to her. Preston's expression was thoughtful. "We'll help her rebuild. The whole town will. But that will take months, and winter's coming," Ruby pointed out. "And where will I—" "You know you have a place at the ranch," Preston said quietly. "Both of you do if you want it. The house is plenty big enough." Ruby looked up at him, seeing past the soot and exhaustion to the steadiness beneath. In this crisis, he had acted without hesitation, organizing, helping, providing. Not with grand gestures, but with practical support when it was most needed. "Let me talk to Mrs. Miller tomorrow," Ruby said, "after she's had time to process everything." Preston nodded, understanding the weight of the decision. "Whatever you decide, I'm here." The simple statement carried more meaning than its 4 words might suggest. In the face of disaster, Preston Walker had proven himself to be exactly what he claimed, a man who could be counted on when it mattered most. As Ruby settled into her hotel room that night, her few salvaged possessions beside her, she thought about how quickly life could change course. 24 hours ago, she had been cautiously considering a future that included Preston and the ranch. Now, that future seemed both more urgent and more appealing, not as an escape, but as a deliberate choice to build something lasting on the foundation of her past. The decision crystallized in her heart as she drifted towards sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in a very long time, Ruby didn't face them alone. That knowledge brought a peace that not even the night's tragedy could shake. The morning after the fire dawned cold and clear, the destruction of the boarding house starkly visible in the harsh light of day. Ruby and Mrs. Miller stood across the street, surveying the blackened ruins of what had been their home and livelihood. 40 years, Mrs. Miller said softly. "Harold and I bought that place when we were newlyweds, raised our son there before he moved east." She wiped a tear from her weathered cheek. "Thought I'd end my days there too." Ruby squeezed the older woman's hand. "We'll figure something out. The town won't let you go without shelter." "The town has been kind," Mrs. Miller acknowledged. "But charity only stretches so far, and I'm too old to start over." Preston approached them, leading his horse. He had spent the morning conferring with the town council about relief efforts for those displaced by the fire. "Mrs. Miller," he said, tipping his hat respectfully, "the council is organizing a work party to clear the site, salvage what can be saved. They're talking about a community effort to rebuild in the spring." The widow nodded gratefully, but her expression remained despondent. That's very kind, but what am I to do until then? Winter's nearly upon us. Preston glanced at Ruby, a question in his eyes. She gave him a slight nod, having already made her decision. Ruby and I have been talking, he said carefully. We'd like to offer you a place at the ranch for as long as you need it. The house has plenty of room, and to be frank, we could use your expertise. Ruby will be helping me run things, and an extra pair of hands would be welcome, especially with my plans to expand. Mrs. Miller looked between them, her sharp eyes missing nothing. You two have come to an understanding, then? Ruby stepped closer to Preston, her heart certain despite the suddenness of events. We have. The fire has clarified things for me. Life is too uncertain to waste time hesitating when your heart knows where it belongs. Preston's expression softened with surprise and joy at her words. He reached for her hand, holding it gently in his own. Mrs. Miller observed them with a knowing smile. Well, it seems good has come from tragedy after all. She straightened her shoulders, some of her usual practicality returning. I accept your offer, Mr. Walker, but on one condition I pay my way. I may be old, but I'm not helpless. I've managed a household all my life, and I can certainly manage yours while you two focus on the ranch. It's a deal, Preston agreed, relief evident in his voice. We'll move your things from the hotel this afternoon. As Mrs. Miller walked away to speak with the town doctor about collecting her few salvaged possessions, Preston turned to Ruby, his eyes serious despite his smile. Did you mean what you said? About knowing where your heart belongs? Ruby met his gaze steadily. I did. The fire reminded me how quickly everything can change. I don't want to waste any more time pretending I don't care for you, Preston. These past weeks have shown me who you are now, not the boy who left, but the man who came back. The man who built something lasting and kept faith even when it seemed foolish. Preston brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I don't deserve you, Ruby Sinclair, but I promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of your trust. I'm not without fault in all this, Ruby admitted. I was so hurt by your leaving that I closed my heart completely. If you hadn't come back when you did, I would have gotten on that stage and might have faced a terrible fate. Let's not dwell on what might have been, Preston suggested. We have enough challenges ahead without adding imagined ones. Ruby nodded, glancing back at the ruins of the boarding house. Mrs. Miller has lost everything. Not everything, Preston corrected gently. She has her life, her memories, and now a place with us. Sometimes starting over isn't about leaving everything behind, but about carrying forward what matters most. His words resonated deeply with Ruby. Wasn't that what she herself was doing? Not abandoning her past or running from it, but bringing its valuable parts forward into a new future. Speaking of starting over, Preston said, a hint of nervousness entering his voice, I should make my intentions clear. I'm not offering you a temporary arrangement, Ruby. When I say I want you at the ranch, I mean as my wife if you'll have me. Though she had anticipated this moment, the reality of it still took Ruby's breath away. 2 months ago, she had been prepared to marry a stranger out of desperation. Now, she was being offered marriage by a man she had known most of her life, a man who had hurt her deeply, but had also demonstrated his capacity for growth and steadfast love. Yes, she said simply, her heart too full for elaborate declarations. Yes, I'll marry you, Preston Walker. His smile was like sunrise breaking across the prairie, warm, radiant, and full of promise. He pulled her into his arms, mindful of the public setting but unable to contain his joy. I thought I'd have to work much harder to convince you, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Ruby laughed softly. You have been working for it. Every day since you rode in and stopped me from making the biggest mistake of my life. Their journey back to the ranch that afternoon was filled with plans and possibilities. Mrs. Miller rode in the wagon with their combined belongings, while Ruby and Preston rode ahead on horseback. "We should plant an orchard next spring," Ruby suggested as they discussed improvements to the ranch. "My mother always wanted apple trees along the south field." Preston nodded enthusiastically. "And perhaps expand the kitchen garden. With 3 of us now, and hopefully more someday." He trailed off, glancing at Ruby with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She smiled, understanding his meaning. Yes, hopefully more. In time. The idea of their children running through the same fields where she had played as a girl filled Ruby with a sense of rightness. The cycle continuing, the land nurturing new generations just as it had nurtured her. As they approached the ranch, the setting sun gilded the buildings and fields with golden light. Ruby reined Sonny to a stop, taking in the view with new eyes. This wasn't just her father's ranch anymore, or even Preston's. It was becoming theirs, a shared legacy they would build together. "Welcome home," Preston said softly, understanding her thoughts without words. "Home," Ruby repeated, the word filling her heart with warmth. After years of feeling adrift, she had found her anchor not in escape or in starting over somewhere new, but in returning to her roots and allowing them to flourish in unexpected ways. The weeks that followed were busy ones at the Sinclair Walker Ranch. With winter approaching, there was much to be done: cattle to be moved to sheltered pastures, supplies to be laid in, repairs to be completed before the first heavy snows. Ruby threw herself into the work alongside Preston, rediscovering skills she had learned at her father's side and developing new ones as she took on more responsibility for the ranch operations. Mrs. Miller proved to be a godsend, transforming the ranch house with her efficient management and comfortable touches. Meals appeared like clockwork, the house was spotlessly clean, and somehow she managed to make the transition seem effortless. Her presence added a maternal warmth that had been missing from the ranch since Ruby's mother passed away years before. "You two go on ahead to town," Mrs. Miller insisted one Saturday morning in early December. "I can manage things here for a day. You have wedding plans to make." Preston and Ruby had decided on a Christmas wedding, small and intimate, with just the townspeople and neighboring ranchers in attendance. The timing felt right, allowing them to be married before the worst of winter set in, and giving them the quiet first months of marriage before spring brought the busiest season on the ranch. "Are you certain you'll be all right alone?" Ruby asked, hesitating at the door. Mrs. Miller shooed her out with a laugh. "I managed a boarding house full of cowboys and travelers for years. I think I can handle an empty house and a few ranch hands for one day. Now go." The ride to Silver Creek was pleasant despite the cold. A light dusting of snow covered the ground, and their breath fogged in the crisp air. Ruby felt a sense of contentment that deepened with each passing day. The caution she had initially felt toward Preston had gradually given way to a renewed trust, built on his consistent actions rather than just his words. In town, they split up to complete their errands: Preston to speak with the minister and check on a special order at the general store, Ruby to visit the dressmaker who was creating her wedding gown from her mother's carefully preserved wedding dress. As Ruby was leaving the dressmaker's shop, a commotion near the telegraph office caught her attention. A group of men had gathered, their expressions tense as they read a notice posted on the door. "What's happening?" she asked Tom Wilson, who was among the crowd. "Stage robbery 2 counties over," he explained grimly. "Third one this month. They're getting bolder. Killed the driver in this one." Ruby felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Do they know who's responsible?" Tom shook his head. "Sheriff thinks it's the Blackwell gang. They've been moving this way for months, hitting stagecoaches, trains, even some isolated ranches." The news was unsettling. Though Silver Creek had been peaceful during Ruby's lifetime, the surrounding territories still harbored outlaws who preyed on travelers and settlements. The very stage line she had nearly taken to San Francisco ran through areas known for such dangers. Preston joined her, his expression serious as he too read the notice. "Looks like we'll need to be extra vigilant," he said quietly. "I'll speak with the ranch hands about keeping watch, especially when I'm away from the property." Ruby appreciated his measured response, concerned but not alarming. It was another example of how he had matured, taking potential threats seriously without giving in to fear. They completed their errands and were preparing to return to the ranch when a familiar figure approached them outside the general store. "Miss Sinclair," a smooth voice called. What a pleasant surprise. Ruby turned to find Edward Calloway, the banker's son, approaching with a practiced smile. He had pursued her briefly after her father's death, his interest waning noticeably when it became clear she had little prospect of maintaining the ranch. His sudden reappearance in her life was unexpected and unwelcome. "It's been some time, Mr. Calloway," she replied politely but coolly. "You remember Mr. Walker, I'm sure." Edward barely glanced at Preston. "Of course. I understand congratulations are in order. Your upcoming nuptials are the talk of the town." "Thank you," Preston said, stepping closer to Ruby in a subtle but unmistakable gesture of protection. Edward's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I must say, Miss Sinclair, you've made quite a recovery. From nearly becoming a mail-order bride to marrying into one of the more successful ranches in the territory, quite a turn of fortune." The barb was thinly veiled, designed to emphasize her previous desperation and imply she was marrying Preston for his property rather than for love. Ruby felt anger rise within her, but before she could respond, Preston spoke. "Miss Sinclair does me the honor of accepting my hand, Mr. Calloway. The fortune is entirely mine." His tone was pleasant but firm, allowing no room for further insinuations. Edward's smile tightened. "Of course. Well, I wish you both every happiness." With a slight bow, he continued on his way, but not before casting a lingering look at Ruby that made her uncomfortable. "I never liked him," Preston remarked as they mounted their horses. Ruby sighed. "He seemed so charming once. It's strange how people can wear masks that slip at the first sign of trouble. And other people reveal their true strength when tested," Preston countered, his eyes warm as they met hers. The ride home was quiet, both of them contemplating the news of the robberies and the uncomfortable encounter with Edward. As the ranch came into view, however, Ruby felt the tension ease from her shoulders. This place was becoming her sanctuary, not an escape from the world, but a stronghold from which to face it. That evening, after supper, Preston surprised Ruby by asking her to join him on the porch despite the cold. He had a mysterious smile that piqued her curiosity. "What are you up to?" she asked as she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. "I have something for you," he replied, leading her to the porch swing. "A wedding gift, though I wanted to give it to you before the ceremony." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet pouch. "This belonged to my mother," he explained, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect sapphire. "My father gave it to her when they homesteaded their first property in Kansas. She gave it to me before she passed, said I should save it for when I found a woman strong enough to build a life in these lands." Ruby's breath caught as Preston took her hand. "I've never met anyone stronger than you, Ruby Sinclair. You've faced loss and hardship with a grace that humbles me. This ring represents a promise not just of marriage, but of partnership. Equal voices, equal efforts, equal rewards." He slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as if made for her. The sapphire caught the lantern light, gleaming like a captured star. "It's beautiful," Ruby whispered, deeply moved by both the gift and the sentiment behind it. "Like its new owner," Preston replied, drawing her close. His kiss was gentle but held the promise of deeper passion they had both agreed to save for their wedding night, though the waiting grew more difficult with each passing day. When they parted, Ruby rested her head against his shoulder, content in the moment. 2 weeks until the wedding, she murmured. 14 days, Preston corrected with a smile she could hear in his voice. Not that I'm counting. Ruby laughed softly. 14 days until I'm Mrs. Walker. 14 days until I'm the luckiest man in the territory, he countered. As they sat together in the peaceful evening, the ranch quiet around them and the first stars appearing in the clear winter sky, Ruby marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the brink of desperate departure to the threshold of a new beginning, her path had twisted in ways she never could have predicted. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, noticing her contemplative silence. Ruby traced the sapphire with her fingertip, watching it shimmer in the fading light. "I'm thinking about that day you rode in and told me I wasn't going anywhere," she admitted. "How angry I was at first. How certain I was that leaving was my only option." Preston's arm tightened around her. "I was terrified I was too late, that you'd get on that stage and I'd lose you forever. Instead, you saved me from a terrible fate and brought me home to the place I belong." Ruby looked up at him, her heart full. "Thank you for being stubborn enough to stop me that day. Thank you for being brave enough to stay," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. As darkness settled fully over the ranch, they remained on the porch a while longer, making plans for their future and savoring the precious present. The world beyond their boundaries might hold dangers and uncertainties, but here, in this place they were building together, Ruby had found something she had almost stopped believing in: not just love, but home. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparations and anticipation. The entire town seemed caught up in the excitement, with everyone contributing something to the celebration. The minister's wife organized a quilting circle to create a wedding gift, the general store owner donated supplies for the wedding feast, and even the saloon proprietor offered his best whiskey for toasts. Ruby found herself touched by the community's involvement. After years of feeling isolated in her grief, she was rediscovering the warmth and support that had always been available to her, if only she had been open to receiving it. "Your father would be so proud," Mrs. Miller remarked the evening before the wedding as she helped Ruby with final adjustments to her dress. "To see you taking your place here, continuing what he started." Ruby smoothed her hand over the ivory fabric, reworked from her mother's wedding gown into a style that suited her. "I think he knew all along that Preston was the right man for me, even before I did. He used to say Preston had good hands, gentle with animals but strong enough for hard work." Mrs. Miller chuckled. "Your father was a wise man, and tomorrow you'll honor his memory by building on the foundation he laid." The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the kind of crisp December morning that makes the whole world seem clean and new. Following tradition, Preston had spent the night in the bunkhouse with the ranch hands, leaving the main house to Ruby and Mrs. Miller for wedding preparations. Ruby woke early, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Her heart felt surprisingly calm, her mind clear and certain. There were no last-minute doubts, no fears about the step she was taking. The journey to this day had been winding and at times painful, but it had led her exactly where she belonged. The small church in Silver Creek was decorated with evergreen boughs and red berries, simple but festive. As Ruby waited in the side room, listening to the murmur of arriving guests, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought her here instead of to a stranger's home in San Francisco. "It's time," Mrs. Miller announced, arranging Ruby's veil one last time. With no father to escort her, Ruby had asked Tom Wilson to do the honor. The weathered cowboy, who had known her since childhood, waited by the door in his Sunday best, his usually gruff expression softened with emotion. "You look just like your mama," he said gruffly, offering his arm. "She'd be mighty proud today." Ruby blinked back tears as she took his arm. "Thank you, Tom, for everything." The small church fell silent as the door opened and Ruby appeared. Every face turned to watch her progress down the short aisle, but Ruby saw only Preston, waiting for her at the altar. His eyes held such love and wonder that she felt her heart might overflow with happiness. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. They had written their own vows, simple promises to cherish, support, and respect one another through whatever life might bring. When Preston slipped the gold band beside his mother's sapphire ring, Ruby felt the circle of their commitment complete. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Preston's kiss was tender but held a hint of the passion they would soon be free to express. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors, Ruby felt a surge of joy so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. This was what she had been searching for, not escape, but belonging. The celebration continued at the ranch, where tables had been set up in the barn, cleared and decorated for the occasion. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the festivities. A local fiddler provided music, and soon the barn floor was filled with dancing couples. "Mrs. Walker," Preston murmured in Ruby's ear as they swayed together to a slow tune. "I've been waiting 2 years to call you that." Ruby smiled up at him, her heart so full she could barely speak. "It was worth the wait," she managed finally. As the evening progressed, Ruby found a moment to step outside for a breath of fresh air. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliantly visible in the black velvet sky. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, savoring the peaceful moment. Thinking of running away again? She turned to find Preston watching her from the doorway, his expression teasing but with a hint of genuine question. Ruby held out her hand to him, drawing him to her side. "Never," she assured him. "I found exactly where I'm meant to be." He kissed her then, more deeply than he had in the church, his arms pulling her close against the winter chill. Ruby returned his embrace with equal fervor, no longer concerned about the propriety that had governed their interactions until now. "Perhaps it's time we said good night to our guests," Preston suggested, his voice husky with desire. Ruby nodded, suddenly eager for the privacy that marriage would finally afford them. "I think they'll understand if the bride and groom retire early." They made their farewells amid knowing smiles and good-natured teasing, then walked hand in hand to the house. Mrs. Miller had arranged to stay with friends in town for a few days, giving the newlyweds time alone to begin their marriage. The bedroom that had once belonged to Ruby's parents, and then to Preston alone, now awaited them both. Preston had added a new bedstead and fresh linens, transforming the space into their shared sanctuary. A fire burned in the small fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the walls. As the door closed behind them, Ruby felt a moment of shyness despite her eagerness. Preston seemed to sense her hesitation, approaching her with gentle reverence. "We have all the time in the world," he assured her, carefully removing the pins from her hair until it fell in waves around her shoulders. His tenderness eased her nervousness. This was Preston, the boy she had grown up with, the man who had come back for her, now her husband. There was nothing to fear in his arms, only love to discover. Their first night together was everything Ruby had dreamed of during the long weeks of waiting. Preston was a considerate lover, attentive to her responses and generous with his patience. In his arms, Ruby found a passion she had only dimly imagined, and a deeper connection that transcended the physical. Afterward, lying in the quiet darkness with her head on his chest, Ruby listened to the steady beat of his heart and knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. This was where she belonged, not just in this house or on this land, but with this man who had proven his love through both words and actions. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, his fingers gently combing through her hair. Ruby smiled against his skin. I'm thinking about the day you rode in and stopped me from leaving. How angry I was at first. He chuckled, the sound rumbling beneath her ear. You had fire in your eyes. I thought you might take a swing at me. I considered it, she admitted. But something told me to listen, to give you those 10 minutes you asked for. She propped herself up on her elbow to look into his eyes. Best decision I ever made. Preston traced her cheek with tender fingers. I've loved you since we were barely more than children, Ruby. Even when I left, I was loving you, trying to become a man worthy of you. And I love you, she replied simply. The boy you were, the man you became, the husband you are now. He pulled her down for another kiss, and conversation gave way to renewed passion as they celebrated their union long into the night. The days and weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of shared work and private joy. Ruby and Preston proved to be well-matched partners in both the management of the ranch and the building of their marriage. Their complementary strengths created a balance that made the ranch more successful than ever. Preston's steady hand with the business side paired with Ruby's innovative ideas for expansion and improvement. Spring arrived early that year, bringing new life to the land and new opportunities for the ranch. The horse breeding program that Preston had suggested began to take shape, with Ruby taking the lead in selecting and training stock. Her natural affinity for horses proved valuable, attracting buyers from as far away as Denver. Mrs. Miller had returned to the ranch after their honeymoon period, taking up residence in a small but comfortable cabin that Preston's men had built for her near the main house. She managed the household with cheerful efficiency, becoming like family to both of them. As summer approached, Ruby made a discovery that filled her with both excitement and trepidation. After weeks of unexplained fatigue and morning sickness, she could no longer deny the signs she was expecting their first child. She chose a quiet evening to share the news with Preston. After supper, when they were alone on the porch swing that had become their favorite spot for private conversations. I have something to tell you, she began, suddenly nervous despite knowing how much he wanted children. Preston looked at her attentively, waiting for her to continue. I'm going to have a baby, Ruby said, the words sending a thrill through her even as she spoke them. In the fall, I think. Preston's expression transformed from surprise to wonder to joy in the space of a heartbeat. A baby? He repeated, as if needing to hear it again to believe it. Ruby nodded, smiling as tears of happiness filled her eyes. Our baby. A new generation for this land. Preston gathered her in his arms with gentle reverence, as if she had suddenly become fragile and precious. Ruby, he whispered against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. My Ruby, thank you. For what? She asked, drawing back to see his face. For staying that day, for giving me another chance, for making me the happiest man alive. He laid his hand gently on her still flat stomach. For this miracle. Ruby covered his hand with her own, feeling the future taking shape beneath their joined fingers. Our child will know the story, she promised. How close I came to leaving, how you stopped me, how we found our way back to each other and to this land. Our love story, Preston agreed, with the happy ending we're still writing. As the sun set over the ranch they had built together, casting long shadows across land that would someday belong to their children and grandchildren, Ruby thought about the many paths a life could take, how one moment, one decision could change everything, how a journey that began with heartbreak could lead to joy beyond imagining. She had almost left for a man she'd never met, a future she couldn't predict. Instead, she had stayed for a man she was still discovering, building a future they shaped together with each passing day. You're quiet, Preston observed, his arm warm around her shoulders. Ruby smiled, leaning into his embrace. Just thinking how grateful I am that you rode in that day and said I wasn't going anywhere. Best words I ever spoke, he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. Best words I ever heard, Ruby agreed, her heart full and her spirit at peace in the home they had created together. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ruby Sinclair Walker counted her blessings: a loving husband, a child on the way, a thriving ranch, and a community that had embraced them. From the ashes of her desperation had risen a life more beautiful than she could have imagined, built on the foundation of a love that had weathered separation, doubt, and finally blossomed into unwavering trust. The stagecoach that would have carried her away was long gone, its destination no longer holding any allure. Ruby had found her true destination right where she started, in the arms of a cowboy who had loved her enough to ride back into her life and say the words that changed everything. You're not going anywhere. And she hadn't gone anywhere. She had come home.